All right, Pushy Pants says, hi Glenn, the subject has been discussed a lot this week. Why is Tucker so disdainful of Dan Crenshaw? So, obviously this is a personality dispute. It is two very strong personalities who are essentially waging war against one another. Tucker has been a longtime critic of Dan Crenshaw. He's often used him as a symbol of everything wrong with the Republican Party. And it really escalated when Dan Crenshaw was caught on a hot mic when asked about Tucker, not knowing he was being recorded, saying, no, I've never met Tucker, but if I did, I would kill him. And obviously, I don't think it was a serious threat by Dan Crenshaw to want to go murder Tucker. But that's not something that you say about somebody unless you really are harboring a lot of hatred for them. Yeah, if I met him, I would kill him. And the way it was said, too, it was not joking. It was not lighthearted. It was indicative of a lot of internal hatred. And so Tucker, needless to say, escalated his war on Dan Crenshaw after hearing that, and then Dan Crenshaw has been asked about it and been replying constantly about why he dislikes Tucker. So you can dismiss it as a internet personality beef, and part of it is that, which doesn't make it uninteresting. In fact, it could be interesting just for that reason. But I think there's something much more important going on underneath, which is what a lot of American liberals and people on the left have refused to recognize for a long time, that I felt was so important, that I've been trying to focus on and talk about and see the benefits of in a way that really alienated a lot of people who were on the left, who had previously been readers or viewers or allies or whatever. But it has been clear to me for a long time that the real debates about foreign policy, about domestic policy, about the kind of country that the United States should and should not be, began to take place on the American right with the introduction of Donald Trump into Republican politics, precisely because in 2016, by necessity, since he was running against the Republican establishment, as embodied by Jeb Bush, who they all thought was the inevitable nominee, and that's where all the establishment money was, and Trump won, not just by opposing Jeb Bush, but by the entire Republican establishment ideology that had been dominant in the Republican Party going back decades, since at least Ronald Reagan, even before that. Railing about neocons, about corporatism, about the CIA and the FBI and the security state, about endless war. You listen to Steve Bannon, who was the architect of that 2016 campaign and still has a lot of influence in the world, and he often sounds, in a lot of ways, like what a leftist sounds like in the 1970s or 1980s. Not coming from the same place, not with the same premises, but oftentimes with the same sensibility, the same objective, the same viewpoint. And it was clear to me that, as I just said, if the foreign policy dogma, the bipartisan dogma of the United States was going to be smashed, it was never going to be smashed by the Democratic Party. It was going to be broken by what was going on the right, particularly with this MAGA populist movement. But even though Donald Trump has obviously taken over the Republican Party as by far the most powerful figure in it, there are still huge numbers of elected officials in the Republican Party and in Trump's administration who very much hate Trump's anti-establishment views, hate his populism, are absolute advocates and loyalists to the standard Republican foreign policy that the Republican establishment has long espoused, and Republican corporatism. They hate Trump's tariffs. They hate this talk of labor unions and the working class. And they particularly hate the attempt to reorient foreign policy. They're huge supporters of the war in Ukraine, of the military-industrial complex in general, and a lot of them are too afraid to challenge Trump or to explicitly disagree with Trump because at the moment, that means you're the end of your career in the Republican Party. They look at Liz Cheney or Adam Kinzinger, people like that. And there are others, people who have been dissenters to Trump, and most of them are gone. But that doesn't mean that their ideology is aligned with Trump. A lot of them are waiting for the moment for Trump to become weakened, to become vulnerable. And all these people are lurking there. And Dan Crenshaw is such a perfect example. There are a lot in the Senate as well. People like Tom Cotton and Lindsey Graham. But Dan Crenshaw, and I say this in his defense, I guess, is he has a very high opinion of himself. He was injured in combat. He has, I believe, advanced degrees from Harvard or Yale. I mean, his curriculum is sterling, and he knows that, and he's very impressed with himself. And so he's less willing to pretend or to sacrifice his dignity than most other Republican politicians. He is willing to. I've heard him try to claim that Trump's views on Ukraine are his views, even though it's so preposterous, so that he doesn't have to criticize Trump. But he is just a little bit more candid about what he really thinks, and especially in terms of what he really thinks, his belief in Bush, Cheney, Republican establishment, John McCain, Lindsey Graham type of foreign policy that is also very much the Democratic foreign policy as well. And Tucker could see that from the beginning and knew that Dan Crenshaw was the kind of Republican that, in Tucker's view, would sabotage the Trump agenda and that needed to be purged from the Republican Party. And so he often used Dan Crenshaw, and I think in part because Dan Crenshaw sort of became a very popular figure for a while. He was somebody Republicans, including MAGA, really liked. You know, on the surface, what's not to like about him? He's a good-looking guy. He has this impressive combat record. He has the eye patch. He speaks well. He understands social media. I think he has like several million followers on Instagram. So he seemed like kind of potential future conservative leader. So a lot of people were enamored of him. And I think that was one of the reasons why Tucker wanted to alert people to the fact that, no, he actually has this ideology that is very archaic, that is not in any way whatever you might think of the America First or MAGA ideology. And this, I think, is one of the things that's most misunderstood, especially by people on the left and American liberals, is these divisions inside the American right are vituperative. They're not just questions of style or degree, the way that the debates mostly are on, within the Democratic Party, like the AOC and Bernie wing. You have some disagreements with the kind of Pelosi, Obama, Biden wing, but they're not very fundamental. They're not very ideological. There's questions of degree and style. Whereas the real debates are taking place within the Republican Party, and I think that the question of whether the Republican Party will revert back to what it was before Trump is very much the concern of a lot of people who want Trump's ideology to prevail and not, say, Mitch McConnell's or John McCain's or Dan Crenshaw's. And so I thought, and remember as well that when Tucker got fired from Fox, and he got fired for ideological reasons. I mean, his show was as successful as you could hope it was. They never really recovered. I mean, Jesse Waters has very good ratings, more than I think anybody else in cable news, certainly. But they're not at the level that Tucker's was. He doesn't have the following, that intense following that Tucker had. And you see now Tucker's podcast, it's one of the top 4 or 5 most popular podcasts in the country. His gigantic following, huge amounts of influence. When Tucker was fired from Fox News, there were all sorts of Republicans, none of them willing to put their names on it. But at the time, anonymously running to Politico and Axios, saying how happy they are that Tucker's no longer on the air because that will make their lives so much easier, especially on things like funding foreign wars like in Ukraine. And now a lot of them are just willing to attack Tucker all the time. Now that he's been labeled an anti-Semite and all of that, and an isolationist, a Russian propagandist, they feel like they've sufficiently marginalized him or demonized him where they feel more comfortable to attack him. And this dispute between Tucker on the one hand and Crenshaw on the other is interesting in and of itself, it's entertaining, but it has that importance that it really shows what these ideological divisions are still in the American right. And Trump in a few years won't be the standard bearer of the Republican Party, and there's going to be a massive war to ensure that the Republican Party becomes essentially the mirror image of the Democratic Party so that Americans don't really have a choice on the issues that power centers care most about. That's why they wanted Jeb Bush. Imagine Jeb Bush versus Hillary Clinton. Who cares? It's the same exact factions being served in exactly the same way. And that's what Ron DeSantis was for, by the way, as well, to stop Trump, to give this kind of feel of anti-establishment pop. But Ron DeSantis was there, and if you look at who was behind him and what money was behind him, you will see that it was largely people who believe in the kind of foreign policy that Trump rejects, at least ostensibly. And that is the most important thing to power centers in the United States, is that neither the Democratic Party nor the Republican Party adopt an ideology that truly challenges their interests. And for all the reasons I was just saying, Trump is promising in the sense that he can break things, he's a circuit breaker, as Seymour Hersh put it. That's the same reason that he's feared and despised by so many people who had control of the Republican Party and want to remake it in the image of the old Republican Party, which is basically a mirror image of the Democratic Party, so that Americans, nothing really changes no matter who you vote for. Some social issues are different. Some ancillary things are different, but the foundational distribution of power and how things are organized remains the same. And Trump is a threat to that, which is why The Atlantic held a forum today saying Trump is, quote, upending decades of foreign policy. They wouldn't say that about anybody else. So I've always been interested in these splits in the American right. It's part of what I think is most interesting and promising and exciting about American politics. I've seen people try to foster these debates inside the Democratic Party for a long time, and it always ends up failing for institutional and structural reasons. So this to me is the thing that I still think, in terms of what the Trump administration, his second term is going to be, is going to become, is one of the things that is most important. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.